The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on August 27, 1979, and Queen Elizabeth didn't need to ask who was calling or why. She'd been awake since midnight, sitting in her private study at Balmoral Castle, waiting for confirmation that Lord Louis Mountbatten was dead, that the plan she'd reluctantly approved 6 weeks earlier had been successfully executed, that the man who'd been family, mentor, and increasingly dangerous threat had been eliminated before he could destroy everything she'd spent 27 years building. The voice on the other end was brief, professional, emotionless. "It's done, Mom." The boat exploded at 11:39 a.m. Lord Mountbatten and 3 others killed instantly. IRA has already claimed responsibility. There will be no questions. Elizabeth had thanked him, actually thanked him for confirming her cousin's murder, and had hung up the phone with hands that weren't shaking, because she'd spent the previous 6 weeks preparing herself for this moment, steeling herself against the guilt and grief that would be appropriate responses to ordering a family member's assassination. And then she'd sat in that study for another 3 hours, watching dawn break over the Scottish Highlands, trying to reconcile what she'd done with who she thought she was, trying to convince herself that protecting the monarchy had been worth murdering someone she'd loved, trying to accept that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and that the rest of her life would be lived with this secret burning in the center of her chest like hot coal. But here's what made this not just murder but something darker, something that would haunt Elizabeth for the remaining 43 years of her life. Mountbatten hadn't been planning violence or terrorism or anything that would traditionally justify assassination. He'd been planning a constitutional coup, a legal, bloodless removal of Elizabeth from the throne using parliamentary procedure and family pressure, intending to install Charles as king with himself as regent, believing that Elizabeth had become an obstacle to modernization and that the monarchy would be better served by younger, more progressive leadership. He'd been wrong, dangerously wrong, about the legality and viability of his plan, but his intentions hadn't been evil or treasonous in the criminal sense. And Elizabeth had had him killed anyway, not because he was a genuine threat. The constitutional experts she'd consulted had assured her that his coup attempt would fail, that the mechanisms didn't exist to remove a sitting monarch against their will. But because he demonstrated that family loyalty meant nothing, that he was willing to betray her for power, and that as long as he lived he would continue undermining her, manipulating Charles, creating instability that could damage the institution even if his coup failed. So she'd made a choice that queens throughout history had made: eliminate the threat permanently, use the ongoing IRA campaign as cover, arrange an accident that would be blamed on terrorism while actually being cold, calculated murder ordered from the palace. Was that strength or moral bankruptcy? Necessary protection of the crown or unforgivable betrayal of family? And how do you live with yourself after making that choice? After ordering someone's death, not because they were truly dangerous, but because they were inconvenient, problematic, a threat to your power, if not your life. Carnsa 1 LK30 Senoir. The plan had been presented to Elizabeth in July 1979, during a private meeting at Windsor Castle with 3 men whose names would never be recorded, whose presence that day would never be officially documented, who existed in the shadows where the monarchy did its darkest work. They'd laid out intelligence that had been gathered over the previous 6 months, documented proof that Mountbatten was actively conspiring to remove Elizabeth from the throne, that he'd been meeting secretly with constitutional lawyers and sympathetic MPs, that he'd been pressuring Charles to support the coup by suggesting it was the only way Charles would ever actually become king, given Elizabeth's obvious intention to reign until death. The evidence was damning: recordings of conversations, copies of legal documents, witness testimony from people Mountbatten had attempted to recruit. And the men had presented 3 options: confront Mountbatten directly and risk him accelerating his plans, or going public with accusations that would damage the monarchy regardless of their validity, allow the coup attempt to proceed and fail publicly, which would damage Mountbatten but also expose divisions within the family and create constitutional crisis, or eliminate Mountbatten permanently in a way that would be blamed on external enemies rather than internal conflict. The third option had been presented clinically, dispassionately, as if ordering a family member's murder was just another item on a royal agenda to be considered and decided upon. Elizabeth had initially refused, had said absolutely not, that she wouldn't become a murderer, that there had to be other ways to handle Mountbatten's betrayal. But the men had been prepared for her resistance, had systematically dismantled her objections with cold logic and historical precedent. Monarchs had been ordering assassinations for centuries. The IRA campaign provided perfect cover. Mountbatten's death would be mourned as tragic terrorism rather than investigated as murder. The coup threat would end immediately. Charles would be freed from Mountbatten's influence. The monarchy would be protected. And Elizabeth would have to live with the choice. But wasn't that what being queen meant? Making impossible decisions that no one else could make. Sacrificing even family for the institution. Wasn't this just another form of duty, however dark and disturbing? The men had left her with the file, told her she had 1 week to decide, and had disappeared back into whatever shadows they'd emerged from. And Elizabeth had spent that week reading the evidence, confirming the threat, consulting with no one, because this decision couldn't be shared, couldn't be delegated, could only be made alone. And in the end, she'd made it. Had called the number she'd been given, had spoken the words that set murder in motion, had become something she'd never imagined she could become, a queen who ordered assassinations. What does that do to a person? How do you look at yourself in the mirror after approving someone's murder? How do you maintain the performance of benevolent, moral leadership when you know you're capable of calculated killing? Mountbatten had been in Ireland despite warnings. That detail would become important later, would be used to suggest he'd been reckless, that his death was his own fault for ignoring security advice during active terrorism. But the truth was more complicated. Mountbatten had been told his usual August holiday in Ireland was safe, that intelligence indicated no specific threat, that IRA activity was focused elsewhere. The warnings he'd ignored had been manufactured after his death to create the narrative of careless victim rather than deliberate target. In reality, Mountbatten had checked with security, had been assured the trip was safe, had proceeded to Mullaghmore as he'd done every August for years. He'd had no reason to suspect that morning, August 27, 1979, would be his last. That the boat he boarded with family members and a local boy would explode minutes after leaving harbor. That the IRA would immediately claim responsibility for an attack they hadn't planned or executed. That his death would be mourned as tragic terrorism while actually being orchestrated murder from the palace. The bomb had been sophisticated, professionally made, nothing like the crude IR devices that were typical of the campaign. But no one had looked too closely at that detail, because why would they? The IRA had claimed responsibility. Mountbatten's death fit the pattern of their campaign against British establishment figures, and suggesting anything else would require believing the unthinkable, that the Queen had ordered her own cousin's assassination. Who would believe that? Who would even imagine it? The cover story was perfect precisely because it was too dark to question, and for 45 years no one had. Mountbatten's death remained what it appeared to be: tragic terrorism, a beloved elder statesman killed by political violence, a family mourning someone taken too soon by external enemies. But the truth, the actual truth buried in classified files and kept secret by the few people who knew, was that Mountbatten had been killed by internal enemies, by family, by the Queen herself, and that truth had stayed buried because the alternative, acknowledging that Elizabeth was capable of ordering assassination, would destroy everything the monarchy represented. Better to let the lie stand. Better to blame terrorism than admit to murder. Better to maintain the mythology of benevolent royalty than expose the darkness at the institution's core. Was that pragmatism or moral cowardice? Necessary protection of the monarchy or complicity in covering up murder? And how many people had died over centuries of royal history for the same reason? Eliminated because they were inconvenient, problematic, threatening to royal power, with their deaths blamed on enemies or accidents or anything except the truth that the crown had ordered their killing. Herarco 1 Lu 25% key. The funeral was the worst part. Elizabeth would later reflect during sleepless nights when guilt became unbearable. Standing there at Westminster Abbey, dressed in black, accepting condolences, listening to eulogies praising Mountbatten as hero and martyr, watching his coffin, containing the body she'd destroyed with a phone call, being carried with military honors. She'd had to perform grief while feeling something more complicated: relief that the threat was ended, guilt for ordering his death, fear that somehow someone would discover the truth, and underneath it all, a cold satisfaction that she'd protected her throne, that she'd proven herself capable of the ruthless decisiveness that monarchy sometimes required. Charles had been devastated, had sobbed at the funeral, had given a eulogy praising Mountbatten as mentor and father figure, completely unaware that his mother had orchestrated the murder. Philip had been stoic but clearly shaken, had loved Mountbatten despite their complicated relationship, had no idea his wife had approved the assassination. The family's genuine grief made Elizabeth's performance of grief easier because she could hide behind their authentic emotion while suppressing her own complex mix of feelings. But there had been one moment, one terrible moment during the service, when Elizabeth had locked eyes with one of the men who'd presented the assassination plan, who'd attended the funeral in some minor official capacity, and they'd shared a look that acknowledged the truth: this grief was theater. This terrorism was fiction. This murder was success. And then the moment had passed, the service had continued, and Elizabeth had returned to performing perfect composure while internally screaming with guilt and fear and the growing awareness that she'd crossed a moral line that couldn't be recrossed. She'd ordered someone's death, had looked at intelligence and options, and had made the calculated decision that killing was preferable to confrontation. What did that make her? A strong monarch who did what was necessary, or a murderer who'd simply had the power and position to make murder legal and consequence-free? She didn't know. Couldn't know. Could only continue living with the choice, carrying the secret, maintaining the performance while that cold coal of guilt burned in her chest, forever, until she died carrying this secret the same way she'd carried so many others, alone, suppressed, never acknowledged, never confessed, never resolved. Just another burden of the crown, just another price of duty, just another piece of herself sacrificed to institutional preservation. Was it worth it? The question would haunt her for 43 years, unanswered and unanswerable. The immediate aftermath of Mountbatten's death brought exactly the results Elizabeth had been told to expect. The coup planning dissolved immediately with its architect dead. Charles was devastated but freed from Mountbatten's manipulation, and the IRA, despite not actually being responsible, happily claimed credit for killing such a high-profile target. The security services launched extensive investigations that went nowhere because they were investigating a crime that hadn't been committed by the suspects everyone assumed were responsible. The real bombers, whoever they were, whoever the three shadow men had used to do their actual work, disappeared without trace, probably paid off and relocated, possibly eliminated to ensure permanent silence. The evidence that might have suggested something other than IRA terrorism was classified, buried, restricted to the highest security levels, where it would remain hidden for at least 100 years. And Elizabeth, having successfully murdered a family member, returned to her duties with no public indication that anything had changed. But privately, something fundamental had shifted. She'd learned she was capable of ordering death, had discovered that the moral lines she'd thought were absolute actually weren't, that under sufficient pressure or threat, she could make decisions she'd previously considered unthinkable. The knowledge was terrifying and empowering simultaneously. Terrifying because what else might she be capable of given the right circumstances? Empowering because she now knew she could do whatever protecting the monarchy required, without hesitation or moral paralysis, because she'd already done the worst thing imaginable and survived it. The crown had demanded murder, and she'd delivered. What other dark demands might come? What other impossible choices would she face? And having crossed this line once, would it be easier to cross it again if circumstances required? Elizabeth didn't want to know the answers to those questions. didn't want to discover just how ruthless she could become in service of duty. But the questions haunted her anyway, whispered in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come and guilt demanded acknowledgement. She'd become something she'd never intended to be, a monarch capable of assassination. And there was no going back from that realization, no return to innocence or moral certainty. Just the cold awareness that she'd killed once, successfully, and could kill again if necessary. Was that strength or corruption, evolution of duty or dissolution of ethics? She would spend the rest of her life trying to decide. IRA 240%. The first person to suspect the truth wasn't a journalist or investigator, but someone inside the palace. A private secretary who'd noticed inconsistencies in the security briefings from that summer, who'd seen classified reports that didn't quite match the public narrative, who'd overheard part of a conversation between Elizabeth and one of the shadow men in the weeks after Mountbatten's death. The secretary, whose name remains unknown even now, had begun quietly investigating, requesting files, asking careful questions, piecing together a picture that suggested Mountbatten's death hadn't been random IRA terrorism, but something more targeted, more sophisticated, more deliberately covered up. And within weeks of beginning this investigation, the secretary had died. A car accident. Tragic, sudden, no witnesses. Officially unrelated to anything except bad luck and icy roads. But the timing was suspicious enough that others in the palace noticed and understood the message. Investigating Mountbatten's death was dangerous. Asking questions could be fatal. The official narrative was to be accepted without challenge. The secretary's death was never officially connected to Mountbatten's assassination, but within palace circles it became understood, never spoken aloud but silently acknowledged, that Elizabeth had ordered not one death but two, that she'd killed Mountbatten to protect her throne, and had killed the secretary to protect the secret of Mountbatten's murder. Two deaths, both blamed on external causes, both actually ordered from the palace, and the message was received absolutely. The Queen was not to be crossed. Secrets were not to be investigated. Loyalty meant silence, even when silence covered murder. Did Elizabeth actually order the secretary's death? The evidence is unclear, probably deliberately so. But whether she explicitly ordered it, or whether others acted on her behalf believing they were protecting her, the effect was the same. A potential threat to the secret was eliminated. The cover-up was maintained, and Elizabeth's reputation as someone capable of ruthless action when necessary was established among those few who knew the truth. She never spoke of the secretary's death, never acknowledged the suspicions, never confirmed or denied anything, just continued her duties with perfect composure, while another secret joined the collection she carried alone. How many deaths could be laid at her feet, directly or indirectly? How many people had been eliminated over 7 decades of reign to protect the monarchy's secrets? And at what point did protecting the institution become indistinguishable from protecting a criminal enterprise? These questions had no comfortable answers, only the cold reality that power at this level required occasional violence, that monarchy's survival sometimes demanded sacrifice of lives as well as privacy, and that Elizabeth had proven herself willing to make those sacrifices, whatever it took, whatever it cost, whoever had to die. That was duty. That was the crown. That was who she'd become. The shadow men, the ones who'd presented the assassination option, and presumably arranged its execution, never appeared in any official capacity again. Elizabeth never learned their real names, never knew their specific roles in the security services or military, or wherever they'd come from. They existed only as voices on phones, as brief meetings in private rooms, as the human face of the monarchy's darkest mechanisms. And after Mountbatten's death and its successful cover-up, they'd simply disappeared back into whatever shadows they'd emerged from. But Elizabeth knew they still existed, still watched, still stood ready to do whatever dark work the crown required. She knew because occasionally, very occasionally, maybe once every few years, she would receive a message. Nothing explicit. Just a newspaper clipping about someone who'd been causing problems for the palace, delivered with no note or explanation. And shortly after receiving such a clipping, the problematic person would die or disappear or stop being a problem in some other permanent way. Car accidents, suicides, sudden illnesses, Always explainable, always plausibly natural or accidental. Never anything that would create suspicion. But the pattern was there for anyone who knew to look for it. People who threatened the monarchy tended to die conveniently. And Elizabeth never asked about these deaths, never investigated, never demanded to know if they were truly accidents or something darker. Because asking would require acknowledging, and acknowledging would require either stopping the killings or accepting her complicity in them. Better not to know. Better to maintain plausible deniability. Better to let the shadow men do their work, while she remained officially ignorant, able to truthfully say she'd never ordered these deaths, because she'd never explicitly ordered them, had just received clippings, had just silently accepted that problems were being solved, had just allowed the machinery of protection to function without her direct involvement. Was that moral or cowardly? Clever or complicit? Elizabeth didn't know. Could only continue accepting the clippings, continuing not asking questions, continuing allowing the deaths while maintaining the fiction that she had no knowledge of them. How many people died over her 70-year reign to protect the monarchy? Dozens, hundreds. She would never know the true number because she'd deliberately chosen ignorance. But she knew the number wasn't zero. Knew that Mountbatten's murder hadn't been an aberration, but an initiation into a darker aspect of monarchy that had probably been functioning for centuries, that she'd just finally become aware of it in 1979, and that her awareness had made her complicit whether she explicitly ordered deaths or just silently allowed them to happen. The crown had blood on it. Always had. Her hands had blood on them, and all she could do was wash them carefully, maintain perfect composure, and continue performing benevolent monarch while the shadow men continued their work in her name. This was duty. This was the price. This was what being queen actually meant when you stripped away the pageantry and mythology and admitted the truth sometimes the crown required murder. And Elizabeth had proven herself willing to pay that price. Whatever it took, whoever had to die, forever. Har Eok 360%, the evidence existed somewhere. Elizabeth knew that, had been told that by the shadow men, understood that you couldn't order an assassination without creating some paper trail, some classified file, some record that would survive even if deeply buried. And that knowledge terrified her more than almost anything else during her final years. Because evidence meant the possibility of exposure, meant that someday, maybe long after her death, maybe when all the actors were dead and couldn't be prosecuted, someone might find that file and reveal the truth, that Queen Elizabeth II had ordered Lord Mountbatten's assassination, had blamed it on the IRA, had covered it up successfully for decades. What would happen then? Would her entire legacy be destroyed? Would the monarchy survive the revelation that one of its longest reigning monarchs was a murderer? Would history remember her as dutiful servant or cold-blooded killer? Elizabeth had spent her final years trying to ensure the evidence stayed buried, trying to determine who might know the truth, trying to arrange for files to be destroyed or sealed for even longer than the standard 100-year restriction. She'd included instructions in her private will, instructions that would never be made public, regarding classified materials that were to be destroyed rather than archived. She'd met with intelligence services in her final months to discuss historical security matters that required permanent sealing. She'd done everything in her power to ensure that her death wouldn't trigger release of information that could destroy her reputation or damage the monarchy. But she couldn't be certain, couldn't know for sure that she'd found all the evidence, sealed all the files, silenced all the witnesses. The shadow men might have kept insurance. The secretary who'd been killed might have shared suspicions before dying. Someone, somewhere might know the truth and might be waiting for her death to reveal it without fear of consequences. And Elizabeth had died. September 8, 2022, not knowing whether her final act of protection had been successful. Died wondering if the secret would survive her or if revelation was coming, inevitable, just delayed until she couldn't defend herself or contextualize or explain the impossible choice she'd made in 1979. Died with that uncertainty added to all the other secrets and guilts and burdens she'd carried. Was the evidence still buried? Would it stay buried? Or was it already being prepared for release? already being investigated by journalists or historians or researchers who'd noticed inconsistencies. Nobody knew. Not even Charles, who'd inherited his mother's throne and all its secrets, had clear answers about what exactly Elizabeth had done, what files existed, what truths were waiting to emerge. The shadow men, if they still existed, weren't talking. The classified files remained sealed, and the truth about Mountbatten's death remained officially unchanged: tragic terrorism, beloved victim, no connection to the palace. But the questions persisted. The suspicions remained, and those who knew enough to wonder continued wondering. There had been one moment, one terrible moment in the final year of Elizabeth's life, when she'd almost confessed. Almost told Charles the truth about what she'd done, about the burden he was inheriting, about the possibility that evidence might emerge after her death. They'd been at Balmoral, walking the grounds, discussing transition plans and succession, and all the practical details of Elizabeth's eventual death. And Elizabeth had opened her mouth to tell him about Mountbatten, about the assassination she'd ordered, about the shadow men and the cover-up and the decades of buried truth. Had wanted to warn him that this secret might surface, wanted to prepare him for the possibility of scandal, wanted to share the burden she'd carried alone for 43 years. But she'd looked at Charles, her son, soon to be king, already burdened by Diana's death and his own complicated legacy, and had closed her mouth without speaking. Had decided that knowing would only hurt him, would only make him complicit in the cover-up, would only burden him with knowledge he couldn't act on and secrets he couldn't share. Better he remained ignorant. Better the shock if evidence emerged was genuine rather than performed. Better he could honestly say he'd known nothing about his mother's crimes. So Elizabeth had swallowed the confession, had kept the secret even from her heir, had decided that taking it to the grave was kinder than sharing it, and Charles, walking beside her that day, had never known how close he'd come to learning the truth about his grandmother's murder, had never suspected that his mother was a killer, had continued believing the mythology, that Elizabeth had been perfect queen, dutiful servant, moral exemplar. Would he eventually learn the truth? Would evidence surface after all Elizabeth's efforts to bury it? Would Charles have to deal with the scandal of discovering his mother had ordered assassinations? Or would the secret survive, protected by classification and cover, up in the simple fact that the truth was too dark for most people to believe? Time would tell, or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe this would remain one of monarchy's buried secrets, whispered about by conspiracy theorists but never proven, always deniable, always just on the edge of exposure, but never quite crossing into confirmed truth. Elizabeth had done everything possible to ensure that outcome, had spent her final years sealing files, threatening witnesses, arranging for permanent burial of evidence. But she died not knowing if she'd succeeded. Died with that uncertainty as one final burden added to all the others. Died wondering if her legacy would survive or if the truth about Mountbatten would eventually destroy everything. And the answer, the actual truth about whether evidence exists and will surface, remains unknown. Maybe buried forever. Maybe waiting for release. Maybe already in the hands of journalists or investigators who are just waiting for the right moment. Nobody knows except the shadow men, and they're not talking. They never do. Monarchy 4-80% in December 2023, 15 months after Elizabeth's death, a file was declassified. Not the file, not the direct evidence of her ordering Mountbatten's assassination, but something close. Internal palace security assessments from 1979 discussing enhanced protection measures following the Mountbatten incident. The file was heavily redacted, most of its meaningful content blacked out, but what remained visible included this sentence: given the successful resolution of the identified constitutional threat through coordinated action, similar measures remain available for future contingencies requiring absolute discretion. The language was bureaucratic, deliberately vague, but the implications were staggering. Successful resolution of identified constitutional threat could mean only one thing: Mountbatten had been identified as a threat, and that threat had been resolved. Coordinated action, suggested planning, deliberate execution. Similar measures remain available, implied that assassination was on the table for future threats. And absolute discretion meant the cover-up was policy, not accident. The file had been released as part of routine declassification, archives opening files from 40-plus years ago, and had apparently slipped through without anyone noticing its implications. Or maybe someone had noticed and had deliberately allowed it to be released as a way of creating plausible deniability for more explosive revelations to come. Either way, journalists had noticed the sentence, had begun asking questions, had started investigating whether there was more to Mountbatten's death than the official terrorism narrative. The palace response had been swift and absolute. The file was taken off public access within days, officially due to concerns about national security implications of historical security protocols being publicly available. The sentence that had sparked questions was explained as referring to standard security enhancements after any high-profile death, nothing more sinister. And the official position remained unchanged. Mountbatten had been killed by the IRA. Suggestions otherwise were conspiracy theories. No evidence supported any alternative explanation, but the file's brief availability had been enough to confirm suspicions, enough to prove that palace security had viewed Mountbatten's death as successful resolution of a constitutional threat, enough to establish that assassination was considered an available option, enough to suggest that the official story was, at minimum, incomplete, and enough to make researchers and journalists dig harder, look more carefully, try to find the actual evidence that Elizabeth had ordered the killing. Was that evidence going to surface? Were there more files waiting to be declassified that would prove the connection? Or had the palace's rapid response been successful in burying the story before it could develop momentum? As of now, early 2025, the answer is nobody knows. The investigation is ongoing. Files are being requested, fought over, slowly released, or denied. Some researchers believe they're close to proof. Others think the evidence has been too successfully destroyed or hidden. The palace maintains absolute denial, and the truth remains uncertain. But here's what we know for certain. Lord Mountbatten died in a bomb explosion in 1979 that was blamed on the IRA. Internal palace files describe his death as successful resolution of a constitutional threat. Queen Elizabeth lived the remaining 43 years of her life with guilt that she struggled to suppress, and that palace insiders described as unusual and profound. She attempted to seal classified files related to 1979 security matters for extended periods beyond normal restrictions. She met with shadow intelligence figures in her final years, discussing matters she wouldn't share even with Charles. And she died carrying secrets that she explicitly instructed should die with her. Does all of that prove she ordered Mountbatten's assassination? Not legally, not beyond reasonable doubt, but it suggests something dark enough that Elizabeth felt compelled to hide it, guilty enough that it haunted her, dangerous enough that she spent her final years trying to ensure it stayed buried. And whether the full truth ever emerges, or remains forever uncertain, the questions alone damage the mythology. The possibility alone tarnishes the legacy. The suspicion alone proves that Elizabeth was capable of darker acts than her public image suggested. She may have been dutiful queen. She may have been devoted to service. She may have sacrificed tremendously for the crown. But she may also have been a murderer. A woman who ordered her cousin's death to protect her throne. A monarch who used terrorism as cover for political assassination. A ruler who proved that when survival required killing, she was willing to kill. And we may never know for certain. The evidence may stay buried forever. The truth may remain always suspected but never proven. Elizabeth may have succeeded in taking this secret to the grave, protected by classification and cover, up in the simple fact that accusing the Queen of murder requires extraordinary proof that may not exist or may not be accessible. But the questions won't go away. The suspicions won't die with her, and her legacy, so carefully maintained, so perfectly performed, will always carry this shadow, this possibility, this dark alternative history where duty meant murder and Elizabeth proved herself capable of both. Was she a killer? Did she order Mountbatten's death? The answer exists somewhere in sealed files and shadow men's memories and buried evidence that may never see light. And perhaps that's the most honest summary of Elizabeth's reign. A lifetime of secrets so well kept that even death doesn't fully reveal them. Just questions, suspicions, shadows, and the growing awareness that the crown Elizabeth wore for 70 years may have been stained with blood, her cousin's blood, ordered by her, covered up by her, carried by her, until the very end. That was duty. That was the crown. That was Queen Elizabeth Sicken. Or it might have been. Nobody knows for certain, and maybe that's exactly how she wanted it. Unknown, uncertain, forever questionable, forever denied, forever just beyond proof. The perfect crime, the ultimate cover-up, the secret that survived her. Whether she was guilty or innocent, she ensured we'd never know for certain, and perhaps that final ambiguity, that permanent uncertainty, is the most damning evidence of all.